thank you to Michelle Bilek from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness for coming in to speak with us today on this very important issue that I think has kind of been at the forefront, but it's tucked somewhat into the background for this past year. Michelle, thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Well, thank you very much for having me today.
I think for most of our listeners, as they drive through their communities in the 905, anecdotally, I think we can all say we've seen an increase in homelessness. I know in Hamilton, there's talks, there's tent encampments located throughout the city. It's kind of been a feature in a few communities. And I myself just noticed there's a greater increase in homeless people sleeping in parks, alcoves, walking the streets than previous years.
Mm-hmm.
As somebody who studied this, are we seeing that, or is this just, is our attention being drawn to this for whatever reason this year?
No, I think we're all definitely seeing it. In my experience in doing this work, it's probably got to catastrophic levels at this point. And I think that a lot of people, just everyday folks who are just walking down their streets, notice people at the street corner, asking for money in storefronts. They're going to the park with their children, and it's not unusual for people to be, certainly maybe not tent up, but at least there's remnants of people actually sleeping outdoors, whether that be furniture or sleeping bags, or the individual themselves, just being able to find a space where they feel safe. And so I'd have to say that it's it's not a figment of your imagination, it's a reality. And it's particularly because I'm certain, and it's going to get worse, and we're seeing a new wave of homelessness because of the unaffordability of housing. That seems to be the core issue, whether we talk to people with lived experience who are experiencing homelessness currently. It is going to be affecting many other folks, newcomers, refugees, students, and if you look at the data in Peel and actually throughout Ontario or Canada, the numbers don't lie. We are seeing a definitive influx, or I would have to say, of people experiencing homelessness.
There's just looking at your website, and the something struck me that I've heard a number of times over the years from people who work at organizations such as yours, which is this should be an unacceptable problem. We should be able to end homelessness for good forever. I've heard the same from poverty reduction groups. Mm-hmm. Obviously, sort of close relationship between the two, and yet year after year, decade after decade, it seems that we're not only not making progress on reducing homelessness and poverty, but actually going backwards. And we're seeing in places like Hamilton, lots of good intentions get bogged down in. There was a debate last year about the tiny shelters project, and all kinds of good intentions seeming to get bogged down and not really get anywhere. And it's like, well, here we go again. Nothing's really ever going to change. Why do you think it is that it's such a perennial problem before we even get to the particular crisis that we're dealing with now?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's no secret that there has been decades upon decades of underinvestment in accessible, affordable, and appropriate housing for people. That's just a fact. What we have seen historically is, in times of crisis, actually the federal government's actually stepped up and was able to provide social housing, community-based housing funding for people on the ground. And that happened obviously after the wars, but it also happened during the economic crisis as well in the early 80s. So, quite honestly, ever since that point in time, I would say, early 80s and on, there has been no investment from our federal government in affordable, accessible, or appropriate housing for people. And it was not actually until, believe it or not, the Stephen Harper government came in and started to provide direct funding to communities to provide services to people experiencing homelessness. And that was under what was called the homelessness partnering strategy. But beyond that, and there was nothing. And so we're at a place where cooperatives and social housing providers who were able to take out mortgage with the federal government are seeing an end of mortgage. So we're going to see those properties being lost. What we do see also is, obviously, both of you know that we had a downloading of many responsibilities to the municipal level, one of which was homelessness and housing, but affordable housing, community housing, to the municipalities. And what we also know is that the municipalities have very few fiscal tools in their toolbox to support all these programs and services. So, whether it is roads, fire, EMC, public health, now housing and homelessness, they're completely outstretched to be able to, maintain what existing stock there is, let alone be able to build new stock. So in addition, we've also seen, because of the lack of funding and underinvestment, we've seen private actors come in, and we've seen the financialization of housing throughout Canada. So, whether it's the establishment of REITs, who actually don't have to pay any sort of corporate taxes, and investing in large swaths of properties, or actually, private entities that are even based in Canada, buying and purchasing properties that people can't live in or are vacant. In addition, we've seen also many private actors take advantage of the loss of some of those affordable housing, or renovictions happening as well. So it's a compounding issue of many various different things. I think the lack of policies, on the municipal level, we're seeing issues around whether it's zoning or bylaws. We're seeing, obviously, a lack of support for not-for-profit housing providers to actually access lands and build. And, again, I think that, we have almost like a chess game playing out with all our levels of government. Specifically, you've seen the refugees who are sleeping, or actually there is asylum seekers coming into Canada, seeking supports that they were promised, and sleeping on cardboard on the streets in Toronto, and they're punting responsibilities to all other levels of government without any government taking accountability. And it's very frustrating, and it's sad, because everyday people want to see our human rights obligations upheld. And that, yes, you're right, we all wish to see the end of homelessness, and it's been a long time coming, and now, like I said, we're at catastrophic levels, and it's our responsibility to actually provide solutions to those levels of government so they can do the right thing.
On that note, on the some of the things that you touched upon, I want to get your response to something that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said this week. Basically, when he was pressed on the housing crisis in this country, he looked and he said, basically, housing is not a federal responsibility. And I'm wondering what's your take on that? What's your response to that statement?
Yeah, I really do think he meant that it's not, well, for one thing, they don't provide they don't build is what I'm saying. It's developers who actually build, right? And municipalities will say the same thing. They don't build. It's actually like developers and not-for-profit housing providers that do the building. So that may have been what he actually meant. But you know, the CMHC, which is the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, does actually provide financial supports and loans, and as well as you know, basic grants to municipalities or not-for-profit or even for-profit housing providers to build housing. So CMHC is actually, well, it's an NGO, right? So it's an ungovernmental organization. So I guess, you know, he's basically sort of being correct when he says that. And second of all, it is actually you know, the housing portfolio is at the provincial level, and they set out many of the parameters around where to build, how to build, and provide direct funding. So the federal government gives funding to the province, and the province is supposed to siphon money down to the municipalities to support them with infrastructure. So I would have to say it's sort of sad, because it was the federal government actually who was stepping up, and a lot of our work and our advocacy has been around, you know, providing the tools and solutions that the federal government could be implementing in order to address the affordable housing crisis in this country. But certainly they do have the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, and he provides the policies that are, and the follow through is actually through CMHC for infrastructure, but also what's called Reaching Home, which is the program and service delivery funding that siphons through to communities as well. So they do actually have a large responsibility by putting the policies in place in order for the other levels of government to implement.
I mean, certainly the current provincial government has passed a lot of legislation that has an effect on housing generally, and development in particular generally. How do you see, I mean, has that helped at all? I mean, it's very much been marketed or by the provincial government as, you know, this is how to solve the housing crisis. Has what they've been doing with regard to changes to the Planning Act, with development charges, all the rest of it, is that actually addressing the problem that you face with affordable and low-income housing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would say no. I do believe that you know, again, I do think that we obviously do need a lot more housing, but a complete landscape of housing is what we need. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing is a government that's saying, yes, let's build, but they're not providing, I would say, the necessary oversight and policies, as well as actually sometimes developers, you know, they need to have, you know, some sort of incentive to actually build affordable, right? And so we're not really seeing that happening, at least from what I've seen in our communities. There's a heck of a lot of condominiums built that are like 400 square feet and cost over $1 million. And to be honest with you, I don't think any, you know, working individual who's actually making a pretty good salary would even be able to afford a mortgage of that size, or a property of with, you know, of that cost. So you know, there is information out there that the province could be using that actually has assessed what the core need is in each community. There is a great tool that has been made public from the University of British Columbia, and it's called the HEART assessment tools. And what they have done is they've been able to access data information, including census data, and been able to break down who is in core housing need. So demographically, who is in core housing need? What is the core housing need in communities throughout Canada, including here in the GTA, in Peel? So we have a good sense, okay, so when we're building, what is the type of housing do we need in our community, right? And here in Peel, it is that affordability, that low and deeply, funded or supported housing that needs to be developed here. And so the data is out there. So I think that they have it wrong. It's literally like, okay, we have to build, so let's just build. But what you should be looking at is, what is the need in our province, or what is the need in our community? What is the cost? And then moving forward on creating, an opportunity for a plethora of different housing providers to build that housing that is needed in the community. So it's almost like, well, let's just build, and here you go, developers, here's piece of land and go for it. But we also know that developers, they're in the business, they want to make a profit, right? So knowing that as well, what incentives even can we give for profit developers to ensure that some of those units are family size units, for example. Some of those units are accessible units, for example, but some of those units should be also affordable and deeply affordable, because that is the need in our communities throughout Ontario. So the data is out there, the information is out there. I just am not too sure if a lot of politics comes into play, when it comes to sort of making these decisions.
I as you can tell from my accent, grew up in a different part of the world, and I grew up somewhere in a country that had very large supplies of public housing that were built and maintained by municipalities. It's basically the biggest landlord in every town would be the municipality itself.
That's right.
And so I look around here and go, where's all the public housing, and why do municipalities basically own and run very, very small supplies of housing? Is it as simple as Canada needs to catch up with other places in the world and think, hey, if you're going to have large supplies of affordable housing, you need to pay for it. You need to, in some way, you need to, like you say, create the incentives, which basically incentives is money to encourage developers to actually build affordable housing, because all those community housing or whatever in the UK or in other places in Europe or elsewhere in the world, whenever I see it, it was paid for by the public sector in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair characterization?
Oh, absolutely it is. And I completely agree with you. It's not, I mean, if you look at, even the hard assessment tool has access to like property, right? So who owns land? So different levels of government can find out, okay, so what is our, let's do a scan, what is our land scan, what land is available, where could we build? Municipalities would be able to access that information as well, and maybe negotiate some of those agreements with respects to other levels of government on accessing those lands and being able to build. But again, I think what we saw in the 80s and 90s is a lot of municipalities, including my own, were literally selling off the lands that they had to developers in order to keep the taxes low in our community. And I'm pretty certain that was the status quo during that time period. So a lot of the properties are as well are just owned by developers who are just sitting on the land and waiting for the right time, and obviously their ability to build. So yeah.
Now you in Peel, and Peel is kind of your area of specialist interest, and you co-wrote a really interesting piece in the Pointer website.
Mm-hmm.
About what's happening with the breakup of Peel region into unitary unitary municipalities. What's happening there? I mean, and was when the decision was made to break up Peel, did anybody actually think about things like, hey, what about homelessness and how we deal with that?
Yeah, it's literally, my sense is it was quick. It was quick, and I don't think that any elected official knew that it was going to come so quickly and without any sort of, I don't know, like, here's a heads up, this is what we're going to be doing. So, there was a few obviously conversations at municipal councils about the issue, and it's going to be coming down to money. But what I've heard is there's a lot of conversations happening between the three municipalities here around who owes what to who, which municipality. It's like a chess game happening, and that they're all vying for checkmate because they all, are arguing about what they did or what they didn't or what they got and what is owed. And I think that that's a complete distraction by, what about all the programs and services that have been serving, people, citizens throughout our community over, the last 30 plus years. What's going to happen to them? And, I kind of think, well, if we don't start mobilizing together as a community and ensure that those conversations are being had, obviously with our elected officials when they have those conversations with the transition board, but also us as a community coming together in a unified manner to speak for those who can't speak for themselves on, what is direly at stake, in the dissolution of the region, and that we don't want to be left out. And, all of these service providers provide services, again, from Caledon all the way down to Port Credit. And, how is that going to play out? Now the municipalities are obviously going to have their own, public health, their own housing portfolio, and as well as obviously overseeing homelessness. And so for us, as at the Peel Alliance to End Homelessness and many of the other service providers around the table, we're obviously concerned about, for one, keeping the lights on in our own organization, as a lot of the funding for all of these organizations flowed through the region as being the service manager, or from the federal level as the community entity. And so what's going to happen there, as well as many other extensive programs and services that we've been providing the community around certainly ending homelessness and data collection. But yeah, it's going to be, I think, they haven't, the province hasn't, been secretive about the fact that we're just starting here with Peel, and they're going to be doing the dissolution of most of the regions throughout the province. So if it's not done right here in Peel, it as the template for what will be happening in other communities, I just, I don't want to think that far ahead, but I'm hoping that the province does step up and support the municipalities as they take on many of these responsibilities, and that the municipalities ensure that program and service delivery is sustained, and that the people we serve, the most vulnerable people we served, are at the forefront of their mind when they're making decisions.
It's a fascinating point. We had on Bonnie Crombie a few weeks ago, a few episodes back, folks. Go back, take a look. We're just before the announcement came down, and that was something we kind of hinted at, and the assumption was it was all going to work itself out in the end. So, you're right. It's something we'll have to take keep an eye on as it goes forward. The question that came into my mind as you were describing that is, coming back to like the issue of homelessness. Housing, I think, is the number one issue for a lot of people, not just in Peel or the 905, but I'm going to say in the entire country.
Yes.
Is the housing affordability. And yet it seems that all all three levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, cannot get their act together on this. And as a grassroots organizer who is in touch with people who are on the ground, who are on the cusp of losing their homes, people who are struggling to get into the housing market or to find housing in general, do you take this as a case of our elected leaders are just out of touch with what's going on the ground these days?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well. I would have to probably say absolutely. You know, both of you have been in politics before, and the cycle of elections and, you know, sustaining your party in government is always on the back of the mind of elected officials. So, you know, when you know, me and on the local level or my organization or the allied networks that I work with have those conversations with power holders, you know, we know that that's what they're thinking, right? And so, you know, the work that the Canadian Alliance has done, or even the Peel Alliance has done, or the Ontario Alliance has done, and the many allied networks that I work with from an intersectional approach to housing affordability and homelessness, you know, we are here to provide the solutions. And we have a plethora of research on best practices. You know, we have researchers, you know, we have policy makers who have been doing extensive work on these issues for a very, very long time. And, you know, really what it does is, what to me, it's just, it's sometimes when I have those, it's like they understand that this is the need, but they don't have access to the how. But then also, I think that they're afraid to go too deep because they don't want to lose the next election, right? Because again, this is going to be, it's going to hurt. It's going to be expensive. We have, again, decades of underinvestment in housing and supports for people. You know, there's no question that it's going to be very expensive. So is it going to be something that they really, you know, dig deep into? Because this sort of piecemeal funding, this little bits, you know, support here, a bit of this for your groceries. It's not getting anybody out of the situation they're in, especially people experiencing homelessness. So it's costly. Building takes a heck of a lot of time, right? So any new build pre-con, it takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years to develop. So are there innovative solutions to that, right? Are prefab housing, modular housing, incentives for developers, you know, being able to make purchasing existing rental stock less economically attractive to REITs, right? You know, create an acquisition fund for NGOs, you know, again, you know, push the province for tenant protections. You know, the Canadian Alliance, just before the federal government, we said, hey, you know what? We understand, we're here to support you. Here's what we think. Considering the fact that we can't build fast enough, we know there's a huge wave of homelessness happening. How about you know, providing folks with a homelessness prevention and housing benefit? And we even laid out the cost of doing it. But unfortunately, you know, other issues were more of a priority at hand. So you know, it's really difficult. We understand the dynamics of politics and the cycle of elections, but you know, quite honestly, if we're not at a crisis now, I can't. You know, I really don't know what to say, except that we all have to be invested. We all have to be okay with our taxes, you know, being raised, whatever the case may be, because it's costing us a heck of a lot more to have people living on the streets. and in precarious situations.
And on that note, you had mentioned that the last time the federal government invested or built housing was the 80s. So I'm not a genius, but if you do the quick math, we're coming 4 decades of inactivity on this file. We're now entering into our 5th decade of no building, no investment in this file at all. That gap, does that mean that we are so far behind that we can't make up for it? Do we just keep our eye off the ball for so long that is it possible to play catch up that far back from activity on this file?
Yeah. I'd like to say yes. I'm always optimistic because that's my job. I do believe in the end of homelessness, like resolutely. But we do need to do a lot of various different things, whether, increase affordable rental housing stock, building, literally hundreds of thousands of units, putting in place mechanisms to ensure that those end of mortgages to those affordable housing providers and in municipalities is renewed, ensuring that, there's certain tenant protections in place, being able to provide, like I said, in the meantime, some sort of housing benefit for people to access whatever housing that there is out there. Being able to find out what vacant properties there are, vacant units there are, implement other best practices on ending homelessness, such as, reinstate housing first in the national housing strategy, and reaching home. I think that there are many things that we can do, and we really just have to do them quickly, and we need leadership, right, in order to prioritize some of these solutions on all levels, on all levels, instead of passing the buck to other levels of government, and not bearing responsibility, because we are all responsible, including each and every citizen, to help out our fellow community member living on the street, and whether that's making donations to the food bank or supporting people in various different other ways. So that is our responsibility. That is who we are. If we have if we've learned anything from Tommy Douglas and universal healthcare, it is literally an approach where we have to, make sure that everybody is taken care of. That is our value. And, housing affordability, the right to housing in Canada should also be our value. It should not be should not be our nest egg for when we retire at the end of the day. It should not be a commodity. Housing is a human right. And, since the federal government did implement right to housing legislation at the federal level, we have to actualize that, and we have to actualize that by, yes, big dollars and pretty quickly.
You've outlined sort of a wide range of things which need to do, and like you say, a big and expensive need ultimately that the government needs to get to grips with. Knowing how politicians tend to think in quite simple terms, and of simple wins that they can kind of throw in front of the public and say, look what we did, and it happened quickly. Is there something, is there one thing you could kind of pick out of all those things that would be a kind of relatively easy win for a level of government, whichever level it might be, that isn't being properly thought about now, but they could actually do, and it wouldn't maybe, it'd be something that could be done and get us going in the right direction at least?
Yeah, one thing is difficult, but I do think
it's an unfair question, I admit.
Yeah, but I'll just say a couple of things just from the federal perspective. Again, some sort of homelessness and housing benefit. so that people can remain housed, as well as so that people can access housing, I think is so important. And I'd also, quite frankly, like to see greater alignment between the different ministries, and that's provincially and federally. You know, it is such an intersectional issue happening here, right? So why isn't healthcare talking to housing? Because they're all interrelated, right? You know, why isn't even veteran services talking with housing, for example, right? Why isn't disability talking with housing? Because they're all interrelated. Or quite honestly, women and gender diverse issues and housing, they're all interrelated. So literally, it can't just be like one portfolio or under all everything's, all of our tools are going to be put under CMHC or reaching home. It has to be literally housing, and funding for the housing has to be every single portfolio throughout all of the ministries, throughout all levels, because literally, if you talk to any service provider who's servicing students, for example, or servicing newcomers and refugees, or women's organization, the VAW sector, again, food banks, no matter who you talk to, the core issue to them isn't necessarily that they're not getting paid enough, which is we could probably do another podcast on that issue. But they will say people can't afford to live in this community anymore. They can't afford their housing. And that was the reason why they ended up couch surfing. That's the reason why they ended up, living in congregate settings of some sort. So, it is the core issue, and it has to be literally the top of the line issue in all ministries, in all portfolios moving forward, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm seeing that we're coming up on our time for the episode, so I'm going to call it an end for this one. But thank you, Michelle, for coming on. I think that's going to be a topic for the next foreseeable future. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise. We'd like to have you back on at some point in the future, just maybe a follow-up, and who knows, maybe we solved homelessness in the...
Maybe that's good news. Yeah.
Maybe, but
I'm optimistic. Yeah, you have to be in this work. Yeah.
Well, good on you. But thank you very much for coming on, and all the best for your work.
Well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll have a chance to speak again soon.